Picture this. It's 1700, Caribbean morning, the kind of fog that makes everything feel like you're trapped inside a wet blanket, and Captain William Morrison, they call him Black Jack, though nobody remembers why anymore. He's crouched in the hold of a ship called the Serpent's Promise. Except here's the thing. It's not really his ship. He stole it, and those 3 British warships closing in through that fog, they know he stole it. Now, Morrison's got 32 men. 32. Think about that number for a second. Each of those British warships approaching through the mist carries 200 trained sailors. 200. And 40 cannons. Cannons that could turn Morrison's little sloop into kindling in, what, maybe 5 minutes, if they're taking their time? Morrison knows this math. His crew knows this math. And the math says they're dead men. But here's where it gets interesting. Because Morrison's crew isn't your typical sailor crew. These are escaped slaves, from the sugar plantations on Barbados, men who've tasted freedom and would rather die than go back to cutting cane under the whip. There are Irish rebels, fleeing British justice after failed uprisings back home. And there are Carib Indians who know these waters like, and I love this detail, like their own blood. That's not just poetry, that's survival knowledge passed down through generations. So Morrison's got this ragtag crew, and he's got buckets of paint. Stolen paint, naturally, taken from a merchant ship they'd captured weeks earlier. And canvas. Lots of canvas, from a sailmaker's shop in Port Royal. And as those warships close in, his men are working through the night, painting, draping, transforming their predator into prey. They're turning a pirate vessel into a Dutch fishing boat. But here's what I find fascinating. This wasn't Morrison's idea. Not originally. He learned it from an African warrior, someone who taught him that survival means becoming what your enemy expects to see. Not what you are. What they expect. That's the key. That's the revolutionary insight that's going to change naval warfare for the next 300 years. And it comes from a man whose name we don't even know, filtered through a pirate captain who's just trying not to hang. The transformation goes deeper than you might think. Morrison's quartermaster. Get this, he's a former theatre performer from London's Southwark playhouses. You know, the rough neighbourhood where Shakespeare's Globe stood. This guy understands stagecraft, understands performance, and he's directing Morrison's crew like they're actors in a play. He's telling them to slump their shoulders, move slowly, shuffle around like tired fishermen at the end of a long night. They scatter fishing nets across the deck. They rub fish oil into the wood, actually rub fish oil into it, because what do British naval officers know about Dutch fishing vessels? They know they smell bad. They hang laundry on the rigging. Actual laundry. Because real fishing vessels with real crews living on them for weeks, they've got laundry hanging. It's a detail so small, so mundane, that it becomes perfect camouflage. And then I love this touch. They position 2 men to play the role of arguing fishermen. Just 2 guys, gesturing at each other, having some dispute about nets or catches or who knows what. Background detail. Human detail. When those British warships emerge from the fog at dawn, their captains see exactly what they expect to see. Another unremarkable Dutch fishing vessel, in waters thick with them. The lead ship's commander is a man named Captain Reginald Thornbury, professional sailor, experienced, probably a decent man by the standards of his time, and he sails within 50 yards of Morrison's ship. 50 yards. Close enough to smell that fish oil, which is probably what he remembered about the encounter. Later, Thornbury writes in his log, and we have this log, this actual document about passing a foul-smelling Dutch fisherman of no consequence. No consequence. The most wanted pirate in the Caribbean, the man with the highest bounty on his head from Jamaica to the Carolinas, and Thornbury dismisses him as no consequence because of some paint and canvas and theatrical staging. That moment right there, that's the moment something changes in naval warfare. That's the moment a desperate trick becomes a revolutionary tactic, because Morrison doesn't just survive, he escapes. His crew doesn't hang. And they talk. Oh! They talk. In the taverns of Nassau, in the pirate haven of Tortuga, in every port where stolen goods change hands and wanted men gather, they talk about what Morrison did. And, Here's what makes this story more than just a good pirate yarn. Word spreads. Because in 1700, in the Caribbean, everyone's looking for an edge. The British control the seas with their massive navy, their ships of the line, their endless supply of cannons and powder and trained men. And the pirates? The smugglers? The rebels? They've got desperation and cleverness and a willingness to try anything that might keep them alive one more day. Morrison proved that cleverness beats firepower, that deception defeats detection, that a few pounds of paint and some theatrical know-how can neutralize 40 cannons and 200 sailors. And once that knowledge is out there, once that genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back. Within 6 months, 20 pirate vessels adopt variations of Morrison's technique, and they're not just copying him, they're innovating, adding their own cultural touches, their own desperate genius to the formula Morrison discovered. But that's a story for what comes next, because what happens when 20 pirate crews all start playing these tricks, when the British Admiralty realizes they can't trust their own eyes anymore, when the very ocean becomes a theatre of deception, that's when things get really interesting. So word of Morrison's escape spreads through the pirate world like wildfire. Actually, no, that's not quite right. It spreads like Caribbean trade winds, which is maybe more appropriate, steady, reliable, reaching every corner of these islands where pirates gather and scheme and drink and plan their next moves. You've got sailors in the taverns of Nassau telling the story over rum. You've got merchants in Tortuga, merchants who traffic in stolen goods, naturally whispering about Morrison's trick in the marketplaces, where plundered cargo changes hands for a fraction of its value. And here's what happens. Within 6 months, 20 pirate vessels adopt variations of Morrison's techniques. 20. But they're not just copying him blindly. They're innovating. They're adding their own cultural flavor, their own desperate genius to the basic formula. And this is where it gets really fascinating, because you start seeing this explosion of creative deception techniques. Chinese pirates, and yes, there were Chinese pirates in the Caribbean, men who fled across the Pacific and ended up in these waters. They paint dragon eyes on false merchant panels. Dragon eyes. Think about the psychology of that. They're taking their own cultural symbols and weaponizing them as camouflage. To a British naval officer scanning the horizon, those dragon eyes just confirm his expectations. Oh, that's one of those Chinese merchant vessels. Harmless. Never mind that behind those panels are cannon ports and wanted men. Former Spanish naval deserters, guys who know exactly how the Spanish Navy operates because they used to be part of it. They create elaborate religious displays, crosses, saints, icons. They make their ships appear as pilgrim vessels, ships carrying faithful Catholics to holy sites. And again, it works because it plays on expectations. Spanish colonial authorities see those religious symbols, and they think, pilgrims. We don't. Bother pilgrims. The deception isn't just visual, it's cultural, it's psychological. But then there's Anne Bonny. Now, Anne Bonny is one of history's most notorious female pirates, and she takes Morrison's concept and adds something that only a woman in her position would think of. She uses menstrual cloths and children's clothing on the rigging. Menstrual cloths. She's creating the appearance of a family transport vessel, women and children aboard, and she absolutely knows that naval officers of this era rarely inspect ships carrying women and children. It's beneath their dignity, maybe. Or it's considered ungentlemanly. Or maybe they just don't want to deal with the complications. Whatever the reason, it works. The tactic works brilliantly. Now, put yourself in the position of the British Admiralty back in London. You're receiving reports from the Caribbean, and these reports are getting increasingly bizarre. Your captain's experienced men, professionals who've spent decades at sea. They're describing pirates who vanish like smoke. Like actual smoke. Ships that were there one moment and gone the next, or transformed into something completely different. Admiral Sir Charles Wagner, he's in charge of Caribbean operations, and he convenes an emergency meeting in Jamaica, 1703, maybe 1704, and 27 naval captains show up for this meeting. 27. That tells you something about how serious this has become. And these captains, they present their reports, and it's like listening to ghost stories. Except these are real. Lieutenant James Farwell. I love this account, because it's so detailed. He describes pursuing a known pirate vessel into a narrow channel between two islands. He's got the pirate trapped, right? There's only one way out of this channel. Farwell's ship is faster, better armed. He's thinking this is finally going to be an easy capture. He enters the channel and finds 3 identical merchant ships. 3. Where there should have been 1 pirate vessel, there are now 3 merchants, and they all look exactly the same. The pirates had prepared duplicate false panels. Think about the planning that requires, the coordination. They created instant twins of their vessel. And Farwell can't search all 3 ships. He doesn't have the manpower, doesn't have the time, so the pirate escapes. Again. Now, this isn't just a military problem. This is becoming an economic catastrophe. Maritime insurance rates triple. Ship owners who used to pay, let's say, 5% of cargo value for insurance, they're now paying 15%, and that cost gets passed down to everyone. Sugar costs more in London. Tobacco costs more. Coffee, rum, indigo, everything that flows out of the Caribbean becomes more expensive because nobody can guarantee safe passage anymore. Merchant captains start refusing to sail without naval escort. But the British Navy doesn't have enough ships to escort every merchant vessel. So sugar shipments from the Caribbean drop by 40% in 1718 alone. 40%. That's not a small economic disruption. That's a crisis. The Caribbean is supposed to be the jewel of the British colonial empire, this engine of wealth pumping sugar and slaves and tropical goods back to Europe. And suddenly that engine is sputtering because nobody trusts what they see on the water. The governor of Jamaica, and we have his actual letter, preserved in the archives, he writes to London that the pirates have made the very ocean itself untrustworthy. The ocean itself. That's not hyperbole. That's an accurate description of what's happening. The fundamental assumption of naval warfare, that you can identify friend from foe by looking at their ship, that assumption has been destroyed. But Morrison isn't finished. He's got one more masterpiece in him, and it's going to be the capture that cements his legend forever. The Spanish treasure galleon Santa Isabella. She's carrying 800,000 pieces of 8 from Mexico to Spain. Now, a piece of 8 is worth about $1, in today's money actually. That's not quite right. Purchasing power makes it worth more like 20 or 30 modern dollars. But let's just say we're talking about millions and millions of dollars in contemporary value. This is the richest prize in the Caribbean. Maybe the richest prize afloat anywhere in the Atlantic that year. Morrison spends 3 weeks preparing for this capture. 3 weeks. And the preparation isn't about cannons or firepower. It's about research. It's about theatre. His crew studies captured Spanish naval signals, the flag combinations Spanish ships use to identify themselves to each other. They learn Catholic prayers. Not just learn them, but learn to recite them with the right rhythm, the right pronunciation. And they train a parrot, an actual parrot, to screech Spanish commands. They approach the Santa Isabella appearing as a Spanish colonial patrol vessel. They've got improvised uniforms made from stolen cloth. They've got paper medals cut from playing cards, pinned to their chests like military decorations. And the detail work is so good, the performance is so convincing, that the Spanish captain invites them aboard for wine. Picture that scene. Morrison and his officers, boarding this treasure galleon, walking across the deck, where 800,000 pieces of 8 sit in the hold below. The Spanish captain is pouring wine, probably Madeira or something from Andalusia. He's being hospitable, treating these apparent fellow Spanish officers with courtesy and respect. And Morrison is playing his role perfectly, right up until the moment he puts a pistol to the Spanish captain's throat. The capture is bloodless. Bloodless. Not a shot fired. Not a man killed. Morrison takes the richest prize in the Caribbean through pure deception, through clever acting and psychological manipulation. And when word of this spreads, and oh, it spreads fast, it demonstrates beyond any doubt that clever deception defeats firepower. Every single time. This changes everything. Pirates start thinking of themselves as actors, as illusionists. Navies start questioning everything they see. The whole framework of maritime warfare begins to shift, and it's all because a desperate man with some stolen paint found a way to survive one more day. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Because eventually, the British Admiralty is going to make a decision that would have been absolutely unthinkable just a few years earlier. They're going to bring Morrison in, not as a prisoner, as a teacher. So here's where the story gets really interesting, because in 1721, the British Admiralty does something that would have been absolutely unthinkable just 5 years earlier. They offer Morrison and 12 other pirate captains full pardons. Not just pardons, naval commissions. They're bringing these outlaws into His Majesty's Navy. And in exchange for what? In exchange for teaching the Royal Navy their deception techniques. Now, Morrison is 43 years old at this point. 43. That's old for a pirate. Most pirates don't live past 35. He's been running, fighting, hiding, deceiving for 2 decades, and he's tired. You can imagine the calculation he makes. Keep running until a cannonball or a hangman's noose catches up with him, or accept the king's pardon, get a regular salary, maybe live long enough to die in a bed instead of on a deck or a gallows. He accepts. And he reports to Portsmouth Naval Base. Picture this scene. William "Black Jack" Morrison, the most wanted pirate in the Caribbean, walking through the gates of Portsmouth Naval Base. Officers who've spent years trying to capture him now have to salute him. They treat him like he's a curiosity and a contamination at the same time, like he's a dangerous animal that they've somehow decided to keep as a pet. There's suspicion. There's contempt. These are men from proper families, men who bought their commissions or earned them through family connections. And here's this pirate, this criminal, this outlaw, and he's being given the same rank they have. But within weeks, just weeks, these same officers who looked at Morrison with such disdain, they're leaning forward in fascination, because Morrison starts demonstrating what he can do. And what he can do is multiply a fleet's effective power tenfold using nothing but paint, canvas, and psychology. The cultural collision between pirate innovation and naval tradition creates these extraordinary scenes. Rear Admiral Thomas Matthews is there. This is a man who fought at the Battle of Malaga, one of the last great fleet actions where ships of the line just stood there and pounded each other with broadsides for hours. Traditional naval warfare, honourable, by the book. And Matthews watches in disbelief as Morrison's demonstrations fool his most experienced captains. Captains who've spent 30 years at sea, who can identify a ship's nationality by the cut of its sails from 5 miles away, and Morrison makes them look like complete novices. Morrison teaches them the Caribbean fog trick. You get wet canvas and smoke pots, and you create artificial fog banks. Artificial. You make your own weather. A ship pursues you into what looks like natural fog, and suddenly they can't see anything, and you've vanished. Or you've changed appearance. Or there are now 3 ships where there was 1. The fog clears, and the reality they thought they knew has been completely rewritten. He shows them the moonlight illusion. Silver paint and positioned lanterns can make a single ship appear as 3. Think about the math there. You've got 1 ship, but your enemy sees 3, so they assume you have 3 times the firepower you actually have. Maybe they don't engage at all. Maybe they call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, you're accomplishing your mission unopposed because you've created a phantom fleet out of paint and light. But the most controversial technique Morrison introduces, and this is where the conservative officers really start to object, is the disease deception. Flying yellow flags. Having crew members act out symptoms of plague or yellow fever. You make your ship appear to be a plague ship, and enemy vessels flee without firing a shot. They don't want to risk infection. They don't want to board you. They don't even want to get close, and you sail right past them. Now, the conservative officers condemn these tactics as cowardice. These are men raised on concepts of honour and fair combat. The idea of pretending to have plague, of using deception instead of facing the enemy directly with cannon and cutlass, it offends them deeply. But the pragmatists, and there are always pragmatists in any military organisation, they recognise the value immediately. Captain George Anson is one of these pragmatists. Anson is going to become famous later for circumnavigating the globe, for capturing a Spanish treasure galleon worth over £1 million. And Anson writes that, "Morrison has taught us that the mind conquers the cannon. The mind conquers the cannon." That's a revolutionary statement for a British naval officer in 1721. But here's the thing. You can train people in techniques all you want, but until those techniques are tested in real combat, they're just theory. They're just classroom exercises. The true test comes during the final years of the War of Spanish Succession, when British vessels actually use these pirate-developed techniques in a real military operation. The target is Cadiz. Now, if you know anything about Cadiz, you know it's one of the most heavily fortified ports in the world. It's the gateway to Spain's American empire. It's where the treasure fleets come in, and it's protected by 22 gun batteries. 22. That's hundreds of cannons covering every approach to the harbour. 3 British frigates are going to attack Cadiz, but they're not going to fight their way in. They're going to deceive their way in. These frigates are disguised as Spanish merchant vessels. They've got false flags, false colours, crews wearing Spanish clothing, and they sail past those 22 gun batteries like they belong there. The Spanish gunners watch them sail by and think, "Those are our ships. Those are merchants coming in with cargo." Nobody fires a shot. The British frigates sail right into the harbour where the Spanish warships are at anchor. And then they reveal themselves. The false panels come down. The real guns emerge. And they destroy 8 Spanish warships at anchor before the Spanish can even figure out what's happening. The operations commander is Captain Charles Hardy. Hardy trained directly under Morrison, and after the operation, Hardy writes a report where he credits the success entirely to deception tactics. Not to superior firepower, not to better seamanship, to deception, to the techniques that a desperate pirate invented in 1700 to avoid hanging. By 1725, something remarkable happens. The British Naval Academy, the institution that trains officers for the Royal Navy, the institution that's supposed to represent tradition and honour and centuries of naval heritage, formally incorporates maritime deception and misdirection into its curriculum. It's an official course now. And who's teaching it? Former pirates. Pirates who receive naval salaries higher than many traditional officers. Think about what that means. In 25 years, you've gone from Morrison, crouched in the hold of a stolen ship, desperately painting false panels to avoid capture, to the Royal Navy paying former pirates premium salaries to teach their officers these same techniques. The transformation is complete. The outlaws have become the teachers. Their desperate tricks are now official doctrine of the world's most powerful navy. And here's the kicker. This is just the beginning. Because these techniques, this philosophy of deception over force, it's going to spread far beyond the British Navy. It's going to influence warfare for the next 3 centuries. It's going to show up in places and times that would have been absolutely unimaginable to Morrison and his crew of escaped slaves and Irish rebels and Carib Indians. But that's a story that spans revolutions, civil wars, world wars, and eventually leads us to technology that Morrison couldn't have conceived of in his wildest dreams. Technology that costs billions, but serves the exact same purpose as his stolen paint and canvas. So Morrison's legacy doesn't stay contained in the British Navy. It can't, because knowledge like this, once it's out there, once it's been proven to work, it spreads, and it spreads in ways that nobody could have predicted back in 1725 when the Naval Academy first started teaching these techniques. Fast forward to the American Revolution. It's 1779, and there's this American naval commander named John Paul Jones. Now, Jones is famous for a lot of things, but what's interesting for our story is how he defeats British forces that should, by every measure, be able to destroy him easily. And he does it using techniques that are directly traceable to Morrison's manual. Morrison's actual manual that's now in naval libraries from Boston to Bombay. Jones is commanding a ship called the Bonhomme Richard. It's named after Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard, which is a nice detail. And Jones transforms this ship using false gun ports painted on canvas, dummy cannons made from logs, and theatrical smoke effects that make his damaged vessel appear fully operational. His ship is falling apart, but to the British, it looks strong. It looks dangerous. When Jones defeats the British warship Serapis and this becomes one of the most famous naval engagements of the Revolution. He's outgunned. The Serapis has more cannons, more men, better everything. But Jones wins anyway. And after the battle, he writes that he won through the pirate's art of appearing strong when weak. The pirate's art. He's acknowledging the source. He's acknowledging that he learned this from techniques that started with desperate outlaws in the Caribbean. The British Navy finds its own techniques turned against it. The irony is almost perfect, right? They learned from pirates, formalized these tactics, put them in manuals, distributed those manuals throughout their fleet, and then their rebellious American colonies get hold of those same manuals and use them to defeat British warships. Knowledge doesn't respect political boundaries, but the evolution doesn't stop there. It accelerates. Because now you've got steam power coming in, iron hulls, steel eventually, and each technological change creates new possibilities for deception. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, gives us Confederate commerce raiders. These are ships like the CSS Alabama that are designed specifically to disrupt Union merchant shipping. And the Alabama uses false smokestacks. False smokestacks. Think about that. Steam power is this new technology, and immediately someone figures out how to fake it. The Alabama can appear to have 2 smokestacks or 3 or 4, depending on what it wants enemy observers to think about its power and speed. They use painted paddle wheels to disguise their true capabilities. Is it a paddle steamer? Is it a screw propeller ship? You can't tell from a distance, and that confusion creates opportunities. The Alabama captures 65 Union vessels. 65. And most of those captures happen through deception rather than combat. The Alabama appears as a British mail packet, or a Portuguese merchant, or whatever it needs to be to get close enough to reveal its true nature. By then, it's too late for the prey to escape. By World War I, we're seeing the concept reach industrial scale. Dazzle camouflage. Have you seen pictures of this? Ships painted with these wild geometric patterns, zebra stripes basically, bizarre swirls of color. It looks crazy. It looks like someone let an abstract artist loose on a warship. But there's a purpose. These patterns confuse submarine rangefinders. A German U-boat commander looking through his periscope, trying to calculate the speed and heading of a target ship. The dazzle pattern makes that calculation nearly impossible. Is the ship moving toward you or away? Is it fast or slow? The visual distortion created by the paint makes it impossible to tell. And where did this concept come from? From Morrison's insight that paint can change what your enemy perceives. We've gone from making a pirate sloop look like a fishing boat to making a destroyer's. Speed and heading impossible to determine. But the fundamental principle is identical. Then there are the Q-ships. British Q-ships in 1917. These are warships disguised as helpless merchant vessels. They look like easy targets. A German U-boat surfaces to sink what appears to be an unarmed merchant ship. Submarines in World War I still used deck guns for a lot of their attacks to save torpedoes. The U-boat surfaces, the crew mans the deck gun, and suddenly the merchant ship drops its false panels and reveals hidden weapons. It's Morrison's fishing boat trick, executed with steel hulls and modern artillery, but tactically identical to what happened in 1700. World War II brings what might be the ultimate vindication of these pirate tactics, Operation Fortitude. This is the deception campaign around D-Day, designed to make the Germans think the invasion is coming at Pas de Calais instead of Normandy. And how do the Allies create this deception? They create a ghost army, an entire fictional invasion force. They use inflatable tanks. Inflatable. Rubber tanks that look real from the air. They use recorded sound effects of armor and troops broadcast through speakers to simulate army encampments. They have fake radio traffic between fictional units. General George Patton is put in command of this phantom army because German intelligence knows Patton is America's best general, so wherever Patton is, that's where the real attack must be coming. And it works. The Germans hold back divisions at Pas de Calais for weeks after D-Day, because they're convinced the Normandy landing is a diversion. They're convinced the real invasion is still coming where this phantom army appears to be gathering. An entire phantom army created through theatrical techniques that trace their conceptual lineage directly back to Morrison's crew pretending to be Dutch fishermen. Think about that progression: paint and canvas in 1700, inflatable tanks, and sound effects in 1944. The technology changed, but the principle didn't. Appear as anything except what you are. Make your enemy see what they expect to see, or what you want them to see, rather than what's actually there. And then we get to modern warfare, stealth technology. We spend billions with a B, developing radar-absorbing materials, angular designs that scatter detection signals, electronic countermeasures that create phantom returns on radar screens or hide real returns. And all of this serves the same purpose as Morrison's stolen paint and canvas. All of it follows the same fundamental principle: don't let the enemy see what you really are. The F-117 Nighthawk, the B-2 Spirit bomber, modern destroyers with angular hulls designed to minimize radar cross-section, these represent the cutting edge of military technology. They cost more than most countries' entire defense budgets. And they carry the DNA of Caribbean pirates who couldn't afford proper weapons, but understood that perception is the ultimate weapon. Today's naval forces have systems that can spoof radar, create ghost images, make one ship appear as many, or make many ships appear as one. They can fake their acoustic signatures to sound like different classes of vessels. They can manipulate their electronic emissions to simulate being somewhere they're not. Billions of dollars and thousands of engineers creating systems that do digitally what Morrison did with paint. The 21st century's most sophisticated warships, the ones with stealth capabilities that cost billions to develop, they're the direct descendants of a desperate man in 1700 who realized that survival means controlling what your enemy sees. Morrison died in 1741. He was 63 years old, which is ancient for someone who lived the life he lived. He died as a respected naval advisor, with a pension from the Crown, living in a house in Portsmouth. He probably never imagined that his desperate trick to avoid the hangman's noose would reshape naval warfare forever. He probably never imagined that his techniques would still be in use 300 years later, evolved beyond recognition but still fundamentally the same. But that's how innovation works sometimes, isn't it? The most desperate moments produce the most revolutionary ideas. A man who had no choice but to be clever, who had to outthink enemies he couldn't outfight, creates a tactical philosophy that outlives empires. The pirate becomes the teacher. The outlaw's desperate survival trick becomes official military doctrine. And 3 centuries later, we're still building weapons systems based on the same principle he discovered: that perception is more powerful than firepower, that making your enemy see what you want them to see is better than having bigger guns. From paint and canvas to stealth bombers, from 32 desperate men to billion-dollar weapons programs. That's Morrison's legacy. That's what happens when survival forces innovation, and that's why a pirate captain named Black Jack Morrison, who died almost 300 years ago in a house in Portsmouth, deserves to be remembered as one of the most influential military innovators in history, even if he never knew it.